let's roll. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming. This is our first event of the season for Friends of Pine Hall. Starting us off now is Ted Timreck for this year. Ted has a very special connection to us. And that is, he's presented more times over these 20 years than anybody else. You want to guess how many? Rick, how many times has Ted presented? One mover, just very close. This is his 9th, and that's far ahead of anybody, but that was a good guess. Thank you. So very special man, started making films, wonderful films in the 70s, really got the bug of, hey, there's something going on in the Northeast here that people aren't really looking at. Walter knows this extremely well too. So he's made a lot of films, many of them to do with the seashore. Actually, let me ask one trick question. If you lived here 6,000 years ago, where would the sea be?
Way out.
Way out. Yeah, maybe 6, certainly by 8 and 10. I mean, it was because we have a very not a very much of a slope on this continental shelf. So a lot of what you wanted to look for really early stuff is out there someplace. Anyway, so we have all that going on. And last time I just have to say, Ted also made a wonderful film about Great Falls on the Connecticut River in Western Massachusetts that really changed. You can talk about how significant that was, but thank you for doing that. And that's much more recent. Anyway, why don't you can explain much better than I. So here we go.
American libraries are wonderful places, and you have one of the most beautiful libraries around. It really is a pleasure to know that it's here and that it can do things like this, along with the rest of your community, which is really committed. This evening, I've brought you 2 films, and they are films with archaeological surprises in each of them. And I think of them as 2 short bookends to all the research that I've done, primarily in connection with the Smithsonian, but mostly in connection with community groups and individuals locally all over the Northeast.
Archaeologists working with the Mashantucket Pequot discovered a 10,000-year-old Paleo-Indian campsite that fit the classic social model as it was envisioned for eastern North America at the end of the last ice age. On a sandy terrace overlooking a stream called Hidden Creek, a small group of Paleo-Americans set up a hunting camp that probably centered around a single small tent.
The distribution of artifacts really kind of suggested a very limited, kind of tight cluster. We're making friends with the ravens. This is about the center of the Hidden Creek site. We had a big open excavation block here. About where I'm standing was where there was one location of fairly intensive tool making or napping, flint napping. So it's really as if someone had sat right about where I am kneeling, making their stone tools right about here, and now and then, just as something broke, just kind of dropping it off to either side.
The technological style of the Hidden Creek stonework was easily recognized as related to the famous Paleo-Indian tool tradition known as Clovis. The Clovis people, who are thought to have migrated from Siberia to the Northeast, have long been considered the first Americans. Their large stone spear points, often including the unique characteristic of the channel flute at the base, suggested to archaeologists that Clovis was the first culture that could hunt giant mammals at the end of the last ice age. They were thought to be small bands of nomadic hunters who walked great distances across the landscape. But just a few hundred yards further along the banks of Hidden Creek, another site was discovered that challenged the accepted model of all Native Americans being primitive nomadic hunters around 10,000 years ago.
This site
was really a surprise upon its discovery, and informed us of not only certain aspects of prehistory of the region we were missing, but also informed us of the potential problems with archaeologists and archaeology in the Northeast as well. And we had a pretty good handle on the early period of native occupation and use here, the Paleo-Indian period. We have Paleo-Indian sites in the general location, scatters of Paleo-Indian tools around that certainly indicate the landscape was being used pretty early. Then we had this gap during what we call the early Archaic period, roughly 9,000 to 8,000 years ago, where we had almost no occupations. In fact, I don't think we did have any occupations in the Northeast. Because of that change from the Paleo-Indian period, pollen records that were now we know erroneously interpreted suggested a coniferous forest coming in with reduced carrying capacity, fewer resources, and that seemed to explain this lower population density, fewer artifacts, no sites being found. And for 20 or 30 years in New England archaeology, that was the explanation for the early Archaic period. It just didn't exist until we found this site. You know, around me here you see the casino and parking garages, a lot of activity. Well, we did our, a fairly intensive testing program out front of this site on a flat area. And I make that distinction because we're on a hillside now, probably sloping in excess of 10, 12, 15%. It's a fairly steep slope. In our testing program out front, we found a lot of sites, a lot of features. We did not test this slope. And we did not test the slope because who would live on a slope that severe? And I think most archaeologists go with that paradigm. We never test on slopes because there's no sites there. Well, the reason there's no sites found is because we don't test on slopes, because it's sort of a circular argument there. But one of the things we do before completion of any project is we strip an area that we've excavated or studied, surveyed, to make sure we haven't missed anything, features, burials, anything of that nature. And fortunately, during the stripping process, the machine cut into this hillside. And it was fairly dramatic what we saw. And in this profile on the hillside, we saw a series of these dark rectangular stains that eventually turned out to be pit houses. What we discovered essentially was very substantial structures. These were not sapling frame structures, they seemed to be timber framed. Quite an investment of labor and effort. And it's happening in a period of time that we just had no concept. We're looking at a degree of permanency, predictability and resource in the environment, fairly sophisticated scheduling of activities, and they're returning here year after year for generation upon generations.
I don't think any of us had anticipated that in this particular time period we would ever find evidence for settled life.
The pit houses, the types of structures that these people are living in are very much unexpected here in New England. The interpretation has always been that the people that were living in southern New England at that time were very highly mobile. They were very small numbers of people in total, and they moved across the landscape very frequently. And so the sites that we recover, we don't necessarily anticipate finding large amounts of materials because they just simply didn't stay in any one place long enough. Sandy Hill clearly represents something very different going on. After all of the excavations that we've conducted at this site, we have well over 200,000 artifacts that have been recovered from here. Massive quantities of quartz debris, and quartz unifacial tools.
The tool assemblage, it is not anything like we've ever seen before. It's a quartz microblade industry. And what makes that interesting is it's only seen at this period of time. It follows shortly after the Paleo-Indian period with their, beautifully bifacial flake industry. So it looks to be like a different cultural tradition.
One of the surprises at the Sandy Hill site was the radiocarbon date.
We've recovered a very large quantity of carbonized plant tissue. Much of it is wood charcoal, but we also had a huge quantity of charred nutshell fragments or nut hull, almost all of which is from hazelnut. And so we collected a sample of the hazelnut from a single feature within these black sands and sent that off for a radiocarbon date. In the meantime, excavations were continuing out here as we were expecting this area to be removed during construction of a roadway. And so we were trying to get as much material out as possible. When we got the radiocarbon date back from the lab, roughly 4 weeks later, we had a radiocarbon date of 8,920 years ago, which when calibrated actually suggests that the site, at least the earlier components of it, were initially started right around 8,000 BC, so 10,000 years ago. People were doing something out here that produced massive quantities of artifacts, stone debris, and obviously we're consuming a lot of hazelnuts and other materials.
Were two different cultures, nomadic and settled, existing at the same time along the edge of the swamp. It appears that around 10,000 years ago, wandering paleo-hunting peoples camped along Hidden Creek within sight of a permanent village, a complex settlement that wasn't supposed to be able to exist in the Northeast for several thousand more years. Rather than just hunting game, the large Sandy Hill community was focused on the exploitation of plant fiber from the Great Cedar Swamp. Did the Clovis hunters share the landscape with other native groups?
This is the technology at Sandy Hill. And how far from Clovis can you get? It's marvelous. The coarsest possible stone is just barely workable material, yet the edges are marvelously reworked all around. You know, are they for digging? Are these what they're using to dig up their cattail roots? I mean, that kind of makes sense, you know? Great stuff, but again, such a leap from our Paleo-Indian tradition. Like, where does this come from?
So why this is fitting in here, when it does, why it does, is subject of a lot of discussion right now. It's sort of a mystery how these traditions fit together.
There is overlap in the radiometric sequence between the two sites.
Mm-hmm. Is it possible that this weird quartz industry that looks like it came from nowhere has very ancient roots that even predate the typical Paleo-Indian assemblages here in southern New England? Have these guys been hunkering here for over 11,000 years? Is that why we don't get early Paleo-Indian points in Connecticut? Suddenly it raises a lot of questions, and I don't think we have good answers for. I think it's easy to explain them as developing in situ over a 500-year period. No problem with that.
Well, that
However,
makes things a little more complicated.
it raises the possibility of older roots.
If the people who inhabit Sandy Hill 9,000 years ago were the descendants of a much earlier population, that means when the fluted point tradition arrived here 11,000 years ago, there may well have been other people on the landscape already. And that's important because it really changes the way we view people entering what was traditionally seen as an environment devoid of humans.
I think the Sandy Hill site has profound implications on the way in which Native people used the landscape 9,000 years ago, and has profound implications on how archaeologists view that record and how they really need to rethink their old models of Native presence on this landscape that early. You know, if you sort of review what archaeologists used to think about what's going on 9,000 years ago, or even 11,000 years ago, we tend to look at the Native presence on the landscape as somewhat ephemeral. And that's where the model stood for 40 years. And then we find Sandy Hill. And everything we thought about the past is wrong. Profoundly, fundamentally wrong. And what Sandy Hill represents is a very, very complex settlement pattern, social network, subsistence system. The complexity of the site is incredible. In terms of the infrastructure, they're building these massive timber frame structures into a hillside. And the whole idea of them focusing on plants in the wetlands suggests a degree of plant manipulation, encouragement that borders on cultivation, which, you know, I'm
probably being heretical to even suggest such a thing at 9,000 years ago. But we have to consider that.
In 1976, Barry Fell published a book he called America BC. From a small group of New England antiquarians, Fell learned about the mysterious stone ruins of the Northeast. And he resurrected for the public an old American theory. He released the latest wave of American hyperdiffusion. He suggested that Phoenicians, megalithic builders, or Irish monks had crossed the Atlantic well before Columbus and left the stone ruins deep in the forests of New England. I met and explored the woods with the same American antiquarians who showed the sites to Barry Fell and began documenting their discoveries on film. I also began working with Will Getzman, a recent Yale graduate in archaeology, one of the best researchers I've met. I didn't have any academic anthropological training. Mine was in design and communication, so we made a good team. We soon recognized there was no ancient Old World archaeological evidence, no context for Fell's diffusion hypothesis, and in terms of the public, a bitter debate between the northeastern antiquarians and the anthropological pros exploded. In their argument, the stone sites were either pre- or post-Columbus, but both sides could only envision the, quote, advanced cultures from across the Atlantic as being capable of building them. By 1978, we were convinced the stone sites might be indigenous, and that was against all anthropological models. And at the time, our idea was generally unacceptable to either party in the debate. Slowly, things began to look different. After all, there were ritualized landscapes made by Native Americans being found all over the Western Hemisphere. Granted, the Northeast had no native empires like the Inca or Aztec, and they had no cities, pyramids, or extended mound complexes. But how could Northeastern Native culture be less advanced than all other Native groups and still be able to give our founding fathers some good ideas about, for example, democracy? I think one of the keys to this is that the roots of American scientific anthropological theory came from the racially prejudiced Puritan perspectives that were at the foundation of our first higher educational institutions.
Unfortunately, it's long been a scientific dogma that Northeastern Native peoples were among the least civilized of all the American Indian groups. This goes back to the first Puritan settlers and their certainty that Indian culture was not advanced enough to deserve the rights to their own land. American scientific anthropology began in New England, at Harvard and Yale, where the original Puritan attitudes about Native culture were maintained, and those attitudes shaped the evolution of academic science.
At this point, I was asked to join the Odyssey Anthropological TV series at WGBH. I tried to interest them in a program about the mystery of the stone ruins, but they weren't having any of it. But they did ask me to make a movie about the anthropologist Franz Boas and the sea-adapted Indians of the Northwest coast. At the time, I didn't realize how important that research into native maritime adaptation would become. We knew Arctic researchers like Vilhjalmur Stephenson found native stone ruins in the far north. These were sites that could not have been built by colonial farmers. So Will and I went to Bill Fitzhugh, the director of the Arctic Studies Center at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. We were a bit concerned because we knew what kind of reception professional archaeologists usually gave to folks who admitted they were interested in the mysterious stone ruins. But when asked, Fitzhugh was very understanding. He said, "Yes, we have stone ruins. Why don't you come join our excavation up in Labrador this season?" What Fitzhugh and just a very few other scientists were discovering was the maritime archaic. This became the scientific name for the famous northeastern mythic red paint people of Maine, who turned out to be an unknown Atlantic native seafaring civilization that we eventually learned went back to the Ice Age. Fitzhugh proved that these Indians navigated long distances on the Atlantic Ocean, requiring very substantial watercraft. And as we sat at the edge of a high beach terrace in northern Labrador in front of a 4,000-year-old stone burial mound with a chamber built into it, he suggested to me that the real question is, where did these people come from? I've been pursuing this question, primarily attached to the Smithsonian's Anthropological Department, for over 40 years. This discovery became what I think of as a massive black hole in Native American history. Because the existence of an ancient indigenous seafaring civilization along the Atlantic coast of North America creates huge problems for our long-accepted academic history. I admit I didn't understand it at first. Anthropological thought and the glaciers seem to have the same speed limit. But the fact that the discovery and extreme controversy about the stone ruins in the Northeast occurred in the 1970s, in the same decade, the same time frame as the scientific recognition that there was once a sophisticated unknown race of sea-adapted Native Americans who also existed in the Northeast going back to the Ice Age, this was an epic coincidence. So often, the most vitriolic controversies presage what turn out to be major scientific revelations that are realized afterwards.
I think it's a pharaoh.
Who? Egyptian pharaoh. Hey Nick, fire that guy. Egyptian pharaoh.
No, well, don't listen. Careful of my glasses. Get Dick in there for a picture. Dick, if you shoot along where Ted is, you're going to see a face. You might right now. All right, let's be careful of that.
The band holding the basket on
Inside. Boy, it's going to be interesting to see what Mike's compaction comes out to, because this stuff is so soft. I'm scooping this stuff out like it's cereal. Again, look how hard packed this is, and putting my trowel through it, and how hairy it is. It's hairier than I am. But no hair in the feature. Along the edge of the feature, but not in the feature. Look how hairy that is. See, here's another one. This one's cool. But again, I'm just concerned that they're just along the edges.
Yeah, maybe a late deposit. So.
Say again?
Maybe it is a late deposit.
Yeah, but what does late mean? 500 years ago, 100 years ago, or 5 days ago?
Prior to contact.
5 days ago.
You'd even think of doing something like that.
Do we have an outside bag?
Oh, I know. I see what that is.
What, like a little papoose?
It's a snake.
It's a snake?
It's a snake, and there's the head. Yeah, right there. Okay?
That's what it is. It's a snake. This particular site came about as a result of information that was given to both David Ostrowski and myself about a rock shelter in this part of the state forest by a hunter by the name of Earl Gray. And he said, you should look at it because it's an interesting place. Well, we did finally get down to look at it, and what we did is some preliminary probes within the smaller rock shelter to the south of the whole complex, and found that there were potsherds and some broken projectile points. But realizing that it was on state property, we notified the state archaeologist, and he came down and looked at it and suggested that we do a dig here. So we scheduled a dig, and it was quite productive in the rock shelter in terms of more projectile points, more potsherds, different types of material in there. But what we also did is begin probing behind the immediate rock shelter with one volunteer, a volunteer by the name of Maureen Martin, was probing and came up with a copper bead. And from then we began opening the whole area up, and before you know it, several other copper beads were found, a pendant, a crescent, different things like that. It became quite complex. That was 2.5 years ago.
Maybe a bead.
Big piece. It's a bead. Yeah.
That was right on the top.
Make a note about the copper.
The brushes, is that
Beads on the top, 20 to the bottom.
No.
Okay.
It's got a crest in the front.
Look at the face.
Tutankhamun.
God.
Leave some of the dirt on.
Yeah. I got a lot of dirt in the bowl.
No, there's too much off.
Nobody's seen a towel with green tape. It's like my favorite.
What's
Do the back.
that in the front?
Oh, that's where the pipe hole is.
Huh.
You don't want me to
The hole is right there.
There's a bowl
Right
and
there,
the
near,
stem.
right there.
Hey Nick, is that a head on the backside?
No.
The face,
on the face
no,
side.
the face over here.
What's he holding? What's that, a fish on the bottom?
Oh,
You look like a,
Sorry, I thought you were. Yeah, right.
no, not on the, I mean, right under his
that-
chin.
So you hold the pipe like this.
Is
Yeah,
that,
but what's right here? Turn it over a minute. No, it's the other way.
No.
Face up.
So the
face
face is
up.
up.
Face up.
that's the arm.
Right here. See
Those are
right
the
here?
ribs. Those are the
Right
ribs.
here.
Ribs?
Yeah,
No, I don't-
whatever.
Or is it a
It's
fish?
just stylistic. It's
Nick, before you put it away, turn it up. And okay, now on the top side and the back side, are those two heads? Turn it up like this. Those two, are those heads? Take a look.
Right here. The eyes?
Here.
Yeah, they're
yeah, I can't. They look like saddlebags.
Snake heads.
They're snake heads.
Snake is
Oh, they are. They're snake heads.
No.
They're two snakes.
No.
Pair of snakes.
Yeah, there are snakes.
You got the eyes right
Pair of
there.
snakes looking at you.
Here. They got crosshatch on the top. Okay?
I got two snakes on the bottom. The snakes are curling the body around the body. I don't know. No fingerprints on that thing.
Yeah, we're looking for them.
Don't make me yell.
in the initial investigation, we did some core samples. And the core samples were done right way to the back of the,
way in here.
of the shelter, right in there.
Yeah.
And
then we came forward.
And some of the very basic, very initial samples were Bruin. And when we saw Bruin points, we knew we had a site that had very early occupation. Talking in the period of 3,800 to 4,000 years ago.
And we also found several small charcoal pits in here where samples were taken too.
And there were charcoal samples. These charcoal samples have not been dated as yet. They're still in the hands of the state archaeologists
at the University of Connecticut. Actually, we've come through the back end of the shelter, which we were on the front side, into this large rock crevice, which is about 30 feet in length and about 5 foot across, 5 to 6 feet wider at the bottom at the top. We have now proceeded from the original small rock shelter through the crevice into this open area, still aside of these large boulders. As we were clearing off the duff, and I was doing this myself, in an area right in here was a kind of a stone fire pit area, and just below the duff line, as I was cutting it off, I hooked onto a small ceramic pipe that was in size, I guess, quite similar to Iroquoian design.
Iroquoian.
Yeah. In other words, what was found in that particular shelter, although interesting in early Bruin points in potsherds and flakes of flint or chert, is quite typical of most rock shelters. The pipe was the first indication that there was something unusual, and later, and then other factors which we're going to now, and some stone heaps or piles on the other side become increasingly important. Come on. All right, when we first saw the walls, we were impressed by the fact that they're isolated. There are no other walls around here anywhere, and it's a long trek in here. We saw the walls, and we saw the V, and then we looked at the opening, and all this entrapment, these boulders, the pits, the water, and everything, without knowing that there were any points here at the time, we said, why would a farmer in his right mind ever make an opening of such walls to empty into this place where you couldn't get a wagon through and would have difficulty of a horse becoming entangled between the boulders, the water, and everything? And then we focused to the high ridge in that direction, and we said, could it be possible that this was used for a deer kill? That the deer were driven out of the great swamp south of here, driven up into this opening, the natives back in here, natives up in the stones there, finally driving that number of herd into this area during the hunting season when the water is very high and swiftly flowing, becoming entangled in here and doing the general kill here. It'd be a natural kill area just like they did for caribou and reindeer up north, or like they did on the Great Plains, the same type of concept. There's one further point that should be made here for the possibility of this being a deer kill. If you look at the soil up in there, all around here, it's extremely rocky. Unlike the Champagne drawing up around the Lake Champlain, where they had made the same V shape with actually palisades dug onto the ground, you couldn't dig here. But the obvious natural element that's available in great supply is stone. You then take the obvious stuff that's all around you and begin using it in the form of a wall. We think this may represent one of the very earliest walls. If it turns out to be a deer kill, then it was in fact built by indigenous people. It has nothing to do with colonial wall building.
First time when we first discovered this rock, I was here rocking it, and Dave Wagner was probably 100 yards from me, and I yelled to him, And I asked him if he could hear the sound of the rock. He yelled back. He says, no, I can't hear it, but I can feel it. So the vibration was going through bedrock. About 8 tons, easily rolled back and forth within 20 feet of the area that we've been working.
You couldn't anticipate from this rock shelter that these other factors would be related to it. What we noticed on this slide sloping hill is there are a number of series of stone piles. One of the other volunteers had started removing the top part of the stones because we're going to determine for our paper how deep the stone was on top of the larger boulder and if there was anything underneath it, not expecting to find anything. What she had done, of course, she came across a quartz boulder, obvious one on top, and then we found a heavy amount of duff, which is actually adheres to the boulder like this. Underneath the duff, once we removed that and cut it off, we came across 2 pieces, what appeared to be quartz, and obviously you could see the green sulfate of the copper. When you remove the one, like this, were 4 copper beads and a small hook of some sort made of copper like this. Matter of fact, I don't think we got all the copper beads. David, I don't think we got, okay. There's another copper bead.
The copper beads were originally hammered flat and then rolled so that they were not really like copper tubing, but they were made from flat material, probably native copper, and then rolled so that they would either overlap or intersect to create the bead in itself.
Yeah. Another piece that we found within that red ochre plug, as I call it, is this what appears to be a fish hook. We can't be quite sure. It doesn't have a hole. Yes, it does have a hole in it. The copper is not trade copper of the 17th or 18th century. This was analyzed neutron activation analysis, and it was determined that it was almost pure copper and native copper, not trade copper. And so these items were found, in addition to this was a small piece of what looks like a preform, broken. This is actually
white quartz. It's white quartz.
Yeah, it is white quartz in the feature itself too. And, okay, those are the artifacts that were initially found that first day.
So, another surprise? Is it a hoax? Even if it's a hoax, it's incredibly important because nothing like that's ever been found. Certainly in Eastern North America, they found fake Clovis points out west, but nothing like this. The materials still sit in the Pequot Museum. They've never been independently studied to find out whether that green oxidation is just fake added to the copper or what it is. But there are over 700 artifacts that they found. Who is going to put their time into faking 700 artifacts and then burying them and then digging them up, or having somebody else dig them up and try to say it's real? Everything about it is enormously complicated and very interesting because I do think I don't know if it was clear, but the idea that in this last pocket of wilderness, tribal people could carry on their rituals well after the point of the French and Indian War. I mean, there were laws that prevented Native people from carrying on their ceremonies in Puritan New England under penalties of law. So if they were going to do anything, if they felt impelled to, they had to sneak around in the woods. And there weren't very many woods left that where they could actually hide. But this seems to have been one of those spots. So the credibility of the story of a very late, let me give you an example. The scientists said that the pipes were drilled with metal rods. And they said it couldn't be like a mound builder pipe because they didn't have any metal rods to drill the stone with. But they didn't consider the fact that these pipes might have been made in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, 1810. They could have been the remnants of traditions and mixed with other cultures. And then buried in traditional ways. That was never allowed as a possibility. So that the problem of saying it's a metal pipe, therefore the whole bunch is false, really doesn't hold up. But my suggestion as a journalist is you get in there with independent scientists in one of the best laboratories that the Pequot Museum has. You sit down with plenty of Native insight, and you run the tests and see for yourself what you've got. But that's never happened in the last decade or whatever. And I don't have the kind of clout in the cultures that are going to get that kind of thing done either, as much as I would like to see it happen. But that's just part of the example of how, you've got 10,000-year-old structures that were never expected. And here you've got remnants of stone ruins. And by the way, I didn't have the time to show you, but that whole area around the rock shelter has chambers and it has plenty of stone piles. I did manage to shoot another excavation of a stone pile, but it's a large, complex area. It's not just the one thing. And the dates did seem to be old enough, like 4,000. That's seemed to be real in terms of the carbon dating. Anyway, so you've got what I think of as bookends, the beginnings of a culture we don't understand and the endings of a culture that we don't understand. Not that the culture's ended, but the endings of a phase of it being stepped on by civilization. Now, if there are any questions on all of that stuff, including how one gets into this as a pastime, please feel free. Yeah.
Was the copper, does metallic copper exist naturally?
Yes, it's called native copper. It's been mined here, especially up in the Great Lakes area. The mound builders had lots and lots of copper, and you by isotope analysis, you can see the difference between native copper and the copper that comes from Europe and gets imported in, and that's an easy thing to do. But there was a charge that maybe the forgers stole the native copper and made the artifacts out of stolen artifacts. By the way, one of the prime suspects in this forgery hoax, and this is very typical, you blame the artists. If something you don't like happens, in the culture, you can blame the artists. It's either after, it's something they did that turned out badly or something they're going to do. So the painter, David Wagner, seems to, for a long time, I don't know if he still is, have been one of the prime suspects. But it's never been adjudicated or, looked into or proven, or it's all buried. And like I say, if it's a hoax, it's one of the great hoaxes of American history. And if it's not a hoax, it's something we ought to figure out. Yes.
The corollary of this question, the copper, I know there's a lot of copper in the Great Lakes. Is there any around here, or does that suggest the trade routes also exist?
I think, although there's not a lot of copper around here, I think it's possible that there was. But trading Great Lakes native copper to here means nothing. I mean, that's as simple as given. I thought of something. You asked everybody where the ocean was, and it's way out there. 200, 400 miles is where the ocean was at 20,000 years ago. The only thing that you have to add for people when you give them that continental shelf surprise is that thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of New England were covered in deep water at the same time that the ocean was further out. Where we're standing was probably underwater. You know, the Lake Hitchcock, the entire Connecticut Valley, the entire Hudson Valley, the Thames, all those were draining into Long Island Sound, and they were miles and miles wider than we think of them today. We've got just a leftover trickle from the glaciers. 12,000 years ago, or 20,000 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, the amount of water, all of the Northeast was a watery environment, more water than land. The Lake Erie, which was Iroquois Lake, or as actually called the Champlain Sea, was much bigger. Whales, all kinds of Arctic animals up there, and it's just up in Vermont. But that was connected to the Atlantic Ocean. So our little parts of New England were surrounded by huge ocean masses. And we have to realize that people here were ocean-oriented people, water-oriented people. It was harder. You just couldn't move around on land. You couldn't pick up and drag your teepee very far without having a boat. I saw no, yes. Yes. Well, balanced boulders are a long time myth. Whether you go in European antiquarianism or in Native American potential antiquarian thinking, we have many boulders that are set on stones. We call them dolmens. I mean, they call them dolmens in Europe. We call them perched boulders here. That it gets you into the subject of this crossover between European antiquarianism, Stonehenge, etc., and ley lines and all that sort of thing, and the thinking that some people have that our hemisphere has elements of that kind of paleolithically born mysticism, natural mysticism in our own indigenous cultures. This has been since the 60s, since the revival of New Age and all of that. These have been serious problems in terms of getting traction between professionals who don't want fantasy and many antiquarians who are steeped in fantasy. And I've tried for all these years to cut this line between science and, my motto is never get in between anyone and their creation myth. So when I go out in the woods with people, I just try to listen. And I want to hear what their vision of the history is. You can always sort it out later, but why argue, or why even bring up you just want to hear what they think, whether you're talking to a Native American and our culture somehow appreciates a historical remnant of Native America. But when you talk to a New Ager, we tend to not respect so much in some cases what we think of as real fantasy. Those fantasies came from this explosion of antiquarian thinking in Europe. a lot of it trickled or is thought to have trickled over. I don't know how we sort this out. We need another 10, 20 years. Same as we need another 10 or 20 years on understanding how to read DNA properly. But we'll get there. We will, in that space of time, what we're going to know about earlier populations is going to be enormously, geometrically larger than what we're figuring it out now. It just takes a little time. So, yeah. Yeah.
So a question from the audience. This is Henry Pope. How can we support your efforts?
Yeah. How about a graceful retirement? Yeah. You know, I really appreciate anybody who thinks that we could be helpful, they could be helpful, and there is a lot to do. And I would love to do it. At the moment, I've just received a grant from the Smithsonian, through the Smithsonian, to take, I have hundreds and hundreds of hours of documentation of scientists, antiquarians, native people, all the people that I've dealt with following these questions. And I've been storing those in my own storage area. And the Smithsonian would like to have those deposited in the National Archive. So I just got my first grant to begin to digitize these tapes and then hand them over. It's a hard place to know where to start. But that's one area. But what I don't have is an organization or I have a website that you can go to that's got my name. Well, you know, you got the picture somewhere. But that doesn't have any, that just offers people things. It doesn't have any way to, you know, I just never turned it into a business. I don't know why. I should have, because many people have wanted to help with good reason, and we could have done a great deal more. But thank you for that. And I'm sorry I don't have a better way, but reach me on the website or something, and happy to talk. Yeah.
Earlier on, you mentioned the Clovis points and how sophisticated they are, and how they're spread across the northeast and the whole eastern seaboard. Probably earlier than they were in New Mexico. Now, how does that drive the theory of the people coming here, Alaska?
Well,
would think that the population of these would be higher where the people who came in.
That's right. And that's what Stanford was really concerned about. Now, Dennis Stanford, just to go back to him for a second, he was probably the most important paleoarchaeologist in America through the 50-year period of his career. And he was the head of paleo at the Smithsonian Institution. He was in charge of millions of artifacts that are in the collection, paleo artifacts. Now, he was, in that Odyssey series, that's when I first met him. He was making a movie about paleos when I was doing Franz Boas, and we became friends, and we both, well, anyway, he devoted his life to trying to figure out how Native Americans came from Siberia across the land bridge, came down through Alaska, and populated the Western Hemisphere, right? He was the chief proponent of that theory until he was 60, 55, 60 years old. And the discovery of the East Coast, his work turning over the amount of Clovis there, his work looking in Europe at the technologies, and his work in Siberia and Alaska coming up bust with any Clovis precursor that he could find. At that, you know, when you're 60 years old in the Smithsonian, you're the top paleoarchaeologist in the world for America. You usually sit on those laurels and really make it work for you. He turned around and said, we've been wrong. something is not right with our whole theory. And he spent the last 10 years of his life digging into this idea that the East Coast had an important part to play in the origins of Native history. What I'm trying to say is that in my mind, he's a hero. He's somebody who, given a whole life, when the science went the other way, he followed the science, not his career. And ultimately, he wrote a book about his discoveries of that process, and they killed him. The academic world just came down so hard on him, showing you that there's very little room for both success and any change of mind. It didn't bother him much, though. He was not a guy who at that point you could care, because exactly right. He was much happier to be able to continue his scientific thinking, even if it was going another direction. I don't know if that answers the question that you brought up, but we don't know. We don't know. That is the most important thing that the rest of science should figure out, is that we just don't understand it yet. There is so much we don't understand. I'm not kidding by calling it a black hole in Eastern Native history. It's just impossible to see how these discoveries can't change dramatically the next steps as we try to build more histories with Native participation. Yes.
So this leads into a question from Katina out in my actually next year. Question: Ted started to say something about the black hole in Native American history and the coincidence with a huge controversy in the 1970s. Please explain.
Okay. The stone ruins, the mysterious stone ruins. When I got interested in 76, because Barry Fell was saying the Phoenicians were crawling through the backwoods of Vermont, that was an interesting thing for a journalist to try and follow. I mean, and it had certain visual qualities that made it fun to film, and explore. I didn't realize when I started, but once I got to the Smithsonian, that's where they enlightened me, that they were discovering this race of sea navigating peoples who lived along the Atlantic coast at the same time. In other words, the discovery in the mid-70s and the revelation of the stones in the mid-70s were concurrent. But there was the whole controversy about the stones on the land, and the story of the sea peoples was so foreign that you won't find it in textbooks today. Yet you won't. There's a half a dozen scientists in America who are really up on the idea of a maritime native culture. And if you look at the other film, I think we got an ad for it. It's called, it's coming out right away as we speak, I think. It's called Ancient Sea Peoples of the North Atlantic. And it's the story of adaptation to the ocean and ocean navigation on both sides of the Atlantic in the same periods, trying to show how you can equalize what was happening along the coasts of the Western Atlantic at the same time that you can find these discoveries. And the idea behind it, the simple idea, is that it's the ocean that drives the cultures. It's not the cultures that are driving the oceans. It's the oceans that are actually shaping the cultures spiritually, economically, and culturally. So when you put that together, when I was, able to see that the stones were just I'll give you another example. Where I lose a lot of my friends is in the area when I was working on the maps of putting together where all the stone sites were. I discovered that I thought there were links between different sites across the landscape. Now, anybody, any professional or any culturally smart would say, oh, all I was doing was regurgitating ley lines from Europe between megalithic places. And unfortunately, it sounds like that, doesn't it? But in talking to native representatives like the Narragansett, they told me no, that their ceremonial sites were connected, that they would have ceremonies in different sites at the same time. And of course, it was connected to the astronomy, so they knew what time was. This idea that you can, and if you look at my Hidden Landscape series, there's a good, I think, hopefully, explanation of how these lines are constructed across the landscape, and how when you look at your topomaps today, they still have the names of certain places that were put on there by the Puritans. For example, in Connecticut, there is a stone next to a mission church on a reservation, Mohican Reservation, that's called the Devil's Footstep. Okay, and if you run a line, a solstice line, across the landscape, you will go to a waterfall, a high waterfall. The two are just connected on a straight line. And that waterfall is named the Devil's Hop Yard. And at first I thought, okay, they're trying to make beer. It took me a while to realize that footstep and hop are really meant to be connected. But those are the two names that are on the topo maps, and they've been there forever, from the very earliest topo maps. You can run these lines, and we've run them for dates like August 13th, which is the major celebration date for a lot of Northeastern Indians. It coincides with the Pleiades meteor shower, which are supposed to be the departed souls going to their version of heaven. I lose my friends because even working out these lines and telling the story, which is only a way of laying it out, I certainly can't claim any knowledge of it, nor can I claim any scientific proof. But I think that just like here and right here, we should not lose these things before we know what they are, but I have a lot of friends who simply think I've gone too far.
I get two questions.
Uh-oh.
You mentioned the maritime people. It's going back thousands of years. Do we have any artifacts? Or how do we know that they existed? Do we have any artifacts?
Okay.
Boats or anything
Yes.
like
The first time I went up with Bill Fitzhugh to northern Labrador, this was just below the Arctic Circle, and we found a quarry, a chert quarry for a kind of stone that only comes from this one particular source on the globe. You can easily test the stone, and it's at the Arctic Circle, and there was a settlement of these Indians who were taking advantage of that chert. They were taking so much of advantage of it that this chert spread all the way down the Atlantic coast to Carolina, all the way into the Great Lakes. And you can find this Rama chert in burials all around. It was very high. You can't get to the Arctic Circle in northern Labrador without a major craft. You need a watercraft that really works well, and you need to know how to sail it. What was the name of the first, or the Winthrop, Governor Winthrop in Connecticut? He was born in 1608, 1630 or so, he was the governor of Connecticut. His father had been the governor before. He left us notes saying that the Indians in the rivers of Connecticut had 80-man canoes, right? Picture this. a lot of people go, oh, that's really interesting, an 80-man canoe. What they neglect to picture is what kind of a society builds and navigates an 80-man canoe. The 80-man canoe is not a big deal. Some earlier people said, wait a minute, they didn't have trees that big. And I queried that from Tom Wessels, a really famous expert on our New England forests. And I said, listen, I've got a problem. There are certain historians who say they couldn't have logs big enough to make 80-man canoes. And he took me to a ravine, and he showed me the ravine and then a hill and pine trees that grow on the hill, come to their forest lid. And the kinds of pine trees, or the same pine trees that grow in a ravine, will go up as high as the forest floor, right? It doesn't matter where, as long as they'll go up to it, whatever it is. So there's no problem with the 80-man canoes for size, but it's more just simple prejudice. You can't believe that what we think of as the birch bark paddlers could have an 80-man canoe. But why would Governor Winthrop lie? But that's pretty obvious. And one more detail there. There is nothing easier for a buccaneer like Sir Walter Raleigh with a cannon in his ship. There's nothing easier for him to get rid of than an 80-man canoe with Indians paddling around, if you're worried about that. So it's just an aside. But I think this question has not been picked up easily. The same natural skepticism that you have, which I had for years, it kind of takes over. But once you look at the evidence and slowly watch these things come out and talk to the scientists who, Dr. Fitzhugh, bless his heart, has never published his work on his Nuliac discoveries of the maritime archaic. As a matter of fact, he's never put together, he's written books about Mongolia, about Siberia, you name it. He's got books and shows about Vikings at the Smithsonian. I think he's in a very prominent position there. He's the head of the Arctic Study Center. If he goes, I think he feels if he goes too far, trying to tell the story of the archaic navigating Indians, he will reach the same place that Dennis Stanford got when he thought the science wasn't working anymore. And he did publish the books and he showed the evidence, and it's a marvelous attempt at that, but it killed him. Not that they could stop him professionally. You can't fire people from the Smithsonian. But I think Bill understood early on and continues to understand that he doesn't want to jeopardize his own serious career of doing lots and lots of other anthropology by coming out with what he actually thinks about the archaic Indians in the water. However, if you look at the movie that I finished about the ancient sea peoples of the North Atlantic, and if you go to my website, you'll find that movie. By the way, that's the simplest way to start. If you go to my website, twtimreck.com, you'll find a link to that movie. And the thing about scientists, if you come in with a camera and you know them and you work with them, they will sit down and tell you what they really think about what's possible and what evidence they have and how close the evidence adheres. They won't put that in peer-reviewed papers because it's a jeopardy. It's a possible jeopardy if you go too far in some direction. So when you see the interviews that he gives me in this movie, you'll get all these ideas. He says, we don't know anything about this race of Indians. We don't understand. We're so enthralled with the big game hunters of the West, with the big spears and hunting big game. But what we found out is that caribou swim. Caribou can swim across deep water, wide bays. The problem is that caribous swim very slowly. They swim upright. They paddle a caribou dog paddle. They go in herds across bays to get from one stretch to another. If you follow a caribou herd in a boat and you have a harpoon, the easiest thing in the world is to spear a caribou. It's much easier than doing it on land. They run away on land and they're not easy to catch. You either surprise them to death or you don't get them. But when they're swimming, you can just take them out like a whale that is not moving, or a swordfish that's not moving. So when we find spearheads among the maritime coastal peoples, yes, they're looking for swordfish and they're looking for whales and other things that they harpoon. But the easiest thing to get is a caribou. But I don't think anyone put much time into thinking that. And it's so obvious. Another proof? Are we running out of time? Are you?
Well, we can probably have just a few more questions, but go ahead.
Sure.
I just wanted to thank you so much, Ted, for all your work and filming all these years and movies you've put together. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
I used to be on the board of Nolan Vika, and I know that you worked with them.
Oh, yes. Yeah. Another group that saves us.
But yes, I just wanted to say thank you again. And I just wanted to make or ask a question.
Sure.
I noticed, in part of the film, someone said you part of stone structure. And I'm just thinking about a few different Native people that I've met who have said to never do that.
Absolutely.
And so I didn't know, and I know you know another number of those people as well. I'm just curious how you handle that with the filming, as far as sharing films.
That's
Notes that need to be made.
That's a real good question.
Because scientists are taking them apart. That's one thing if they're working with a tribe, but if people see that and they think, oh, any stone structure I see, I'll just go pull it apart.
That's a terrible thing. It's an equation. All right. These researchers find this stuff. They try to get serious scientists to be serious about it and investigate. By and large, they don't want to. They don't want to be informed by the antiquarians, for one thing. And they don't believe it anyway. So the antiquarian is left with this problem. I tell you, I think there's something over here and nobody ever hears about it. I dig up, he was showing us one that they had dug up already. He wasn't digging, I didn't have him dig up a new one. But he has to come, this antiquarian has to come back with something that's going to force on state land. If you go to the state archaeologist and say, look what I found, they got to pay attention. That's the thinking on that one. That's just that one story. I can't apologize for anybody else. Don't want to either, because I don't think it should be done. I think we should wait until our X-ray vision, which won't be very long from now, by the way, does all of our archaeology for us. We shouldn't be touching anything at this point. And nobody at the Smithsonian is digging up anything that they can wait on. You know, the stuff we can't wait on, that's sort of something we have to deal with. But we do that with Native participation as best we can. If they want to, they may not want to, but there's no sense letting the construction company get it.
I just wondered if some of the film footage, if you just put a disclaimer of, please don't do this at home.
I thought of that many times. I find that it actually is just an invitation. Don't have this fun yourself. It's not going to work that way. So,
but I understand one of our board members, Dan Virginia, working with the Native Americans in this area, and really coming up with a set of guidelines that he is now having us both vet and look at.
Great.
Right, it's a two-edged sword. I mean, want to look at it, but then
or do you want to let the developers throw it away without telling us they found it? Which is what happens in most cases when developers discover anything. The last people are going to find out is A, the public, and B, the scientists. Maybe it's the other way around. But so I don't know. I don't know how you solve these kinds of cultural problems. But it's more important to know that we've got the problems. whether we solve them or not, it's really important to know we've got those problems.
And that's the start. And
Yeah.
By the way, it's probably good to mention that Acton does have a bylaw, an archaeological protection bylaw, was passed a year and a half ago. No, it doesn't.
With your help, with Pine Hawk's help?
With a lot of help, and a lot of good understanding, and
good.
It's not a guarantee, but what actually happens is the town will, community preservation funds will fund a study.
Absolutely.
Before you dig, you know.
Well, thanks for that. Thanks for that help. We need that in every community because nobody's immune from having this stuff underfoot.
One more, and then we have to lock up.
Sure.
Did the ice age exist in Europe too, such that?
Yes, it's complete. Take a look at that North Atlantic movie on my website. I run it all down for you. The symmetry of environmental impact and then cultural development that goes on both sides of the Atlantic, between ice melting and people using boats to get, for instance, Norway was not reached by land. The first peoples did not come to Norway on foot, right? Because they only could settle the very edges of the landscape everything else was ice. And the first settlements are at the edge of the ocean. And I didn't even go into anything about our underwater work because last thing, I have stopped going into the field looking for sites or working on sites or documenting sites because there are so many arguments between the profession and the developers and the researchers. You cannot very easily prove to everyone's satisfaction that a lithic site is actually a native ceremonial site in any forests of New England. There are lots of good possibilities. There are lots of erratic farmers who have built strange things. Sorting that out, once you know that's the argument, I don't think there's much that I can do to help that. So for the last few years, or many years actually, we've been working with the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management and the University of Rhode Island, their underwater research teams. And we've been trying to develop, also along with the wind turbine people, we've been trying to develop the protocols so that they will look, which they have to do by law, they have to look for cultural resources on the bed of the sea, on the submerged continental shelf, which was exposed, right, once. Now it's submerged. When they dig for their towers, they're supposed to look for cultural resources. And we tried to develop, with Native people and scientists, we tried to develop what kind of rules that should have. I'm convinced that that's the place that I should be looking for anything, because when we find a burial mound out there, we will not be able to blame it on colonial farmers. And that is simply the moment that we're looking for. We want, and the natives tell me it's got to be out there. The scientists tell me it's got to be out there. Some scientists say it's all been washed away. But as my friend Doug Harris says, you can't say that and not look, right? That's really important. So that's where I think this is going. And take a look at this. There's a long section on that in this North Atlantic movie, which really just does wrap up about 45 years of research, sort of highlights of the best discoveries.